Hello and welcome to the next lecture for this class. We'll cover two important topics. The first would be travel west as well as Southern society. A previous lecture identified how the United States acquired territory in the West. Today, we'll see how people traveled there and what life was like in those western regions. Next, we'll continue a discussion of slavery by looking at what life was like for slaves. And then we'll explore the structure of Southern society. We'll begin by exploring why people traveled to those western regions. So what motivated people to travel west? Well, religion was one important factor, and we'll explore the actions of the Mormons next. The Mormon Church is more properly known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The image here shows Joseph Smith. He was the founder of the Mormon Church. He grew up in New York, and from an early age he was very interested in religion. He began to have visions, particularly after long stretches of time in the woods as he would meditate. Eventually, he founded a brand new religion, the Mormon Church, in 1830, but they faced a great deal of persecution. They moved from New York to Ohio, then Missouri, and finally, Illinois. The arrows on this map identify some of the westward travels of Mormon followers. From New York, they moved to Kirtland, Ohio, and then Nauvoo, Illinois. The reason why Mormon followers consistently moved westward is that they faced persecution. One of the reasons is because Joseph Smith claimed that he had been visited by an angel who dictated a new book, a religious book called the Book of Mormon, which seemed to undermine many of the passages from the New as well as Old Testaments. Also, many Mormon followers appeared to violate the concept of separation of church and state, as political leaders were also religious leaders at the same time. For example, Joseph Smith served as mayor and a religious leader in more than one community. Mormon followers also were accused of odd sexual practices, particularly polygamy. In 1844, the founder of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith, was murdered by a mob. Following the death of their leader, a new leader emerged. That was Brigham Young, and he's shown here. Young wanted to bring more isolation and protection for Mormon followers because their goal was to escape that religious persecution. So, eventually they decided to migrate and then settle to Utah, beginning in 1847. The area circled here shows one of those Mormon settlements in Nauvoo, Illinois. Eventually, they followed the Mormon Trail and ended up in the area around Salt Lake City, where the arrow is shown. After some initial troubles, by 1848, over 5,000 settlers had migrated to Utah. Then, in the 1890s, Utah entered the Union as a state. One of the success stories would be the tremendous level of irrigation that they brought to basically what was a desert. The Mormons flourished in this Great Basin area of Utah. So just to give us a little bit of current events, eventually there was an important college that was founded in Utah, Brigham Young University, named after the important Mormon leader who oversaw this transformation of the Mormon settlements into Utah. And I don't know if anyone's a football fan or not, but the image on the right shows Steve Young. He was a Hall of Fame football player for the San Francisco 49ers. He was a quarterback. He is a direct descendant of Brigham Young. Religion wasn't the only motivation for people to travel west. There was also access to free land. Congress passed the Donation Land Claim Act in 1850, and this provided for free land in what was then called the Oregon Country. First, any white male citizen or someone who wasn't a citizen but was applying to be one could receive 320 acres of land. If married, the family could receive an additional 320 acres. The purple area of this map identifies the Oregon Country. The arrow is pointing to western Oregon. Most of the property that was handed out was in Oregon's Willamette Valley. This was a great area for growing crops. The final requirement under the rules from the Donation Land Claim Act was that the land had to be occupied for at least 4 years and improved. Once this was done, this property would be handed over to the people who were occupying it. Several thousand families took advantage of this access to free land. About 2.5 million acres was handed out in about a 5-year time period, and 7,000 people. However, one thing to point out is that the people who were eligible for this were men, and you had to be white. So many Native Americans who had actually lived in that area and had recently signed treaties with the U.S. government giving up access to their territory, they lost it because only whites were eligible for this land. One last item that motivated people to travel was gold. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento. The image on the right identifies a group of people listening to or getting the information about the news from California, which had been confirmed by President Polk in one of his speeches from 1848. This set off a huge gold rush. We see some statistics on the left where the non-Indian population exploded between 1848 and 1852 in what is now California. In many ways, the American West became a meeting ground for people from all over the world as people flocked from China, from the East Coast, from Mexico, from many different areas to try to strike it rich in California. By the mid-1850s, 20% of California's population had been born in China. Early prospectors often made a lot of money, and they could earn as much as $50 a day. The bulk of those gold rush immigrants were male, maybe about 95%. And while early people were able to make fortunes, most of those migrants on the gold rush did not. Actually, more money was sold selling things to prospectors than was actually mined from the gold fields of California. On the left, we see an image of a guy named Levi Strauss who sold pants and other materials to many of those miners, making a fortune for himself. Now, the reason why the San Francisco football team is called the 49ers is because of this historical gold rush from the 1840s. Now that we've identified some reasons why people traveled, let's explore how they did so. If you had enough money, well, you might travel by sea. It was actually the fastest way to get to the West. Here we see a map of the Western Hemisphere. Ships started in areas on the East Coast, went around the tip of South America, and ended up on the West Coast. If you traveled by sea, more than likely you were looking to go to the gold fields. Most people did not have the money in order to travel by sea. Instead, they took overland trails. It's estimated that between 1840 and about 1860, approximately 300,000 people took those overland trails. The most common destination was California, but people also traveled to Oregon and Utah. The most common starting point for people's westward journey was Independence, Missouri. They would get the supplies and whatever was necessary, and then they would take those overland trails from there. Have you ever visited the Arch in St. Louis? Well, the reason why it's there is because this is to symbolize the fact that St. Louis and Independence, Missouri became the gateway to the West. I've never gone in it, but I'd like to try it someday. That westward journey was long. It might take maybe between 4 to 6 months, just depending upon when they left and what conditions they were facing. Often they would leave in the late spring so that their oxen would have enough to naturally graze on the grasses that would grow. The most important expense was their transportation. You would need a wagon and gear, and that might cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $400. The reason why most of the people who were kind of on the middling classes traveled on this is that getting $400 and having enough capital for that really cost a lot of money. So you might see people who were merchants or professionals who might be trying to strike it rich and trying to start a new life by traveling west on these overland trails. Again, here we see this map of the westward trails starting in Independence. You might end up going to Santa Fe or Salt Lake City or Sacramento. And another place would be Oregon City in that Willamette Valley of the Oregon country. Many of those travelers had a fear of conflict with Indians. Well, while there was some conflict, in many ways and in most cases, the interaction between Native Americans and those settlers and travelers was positive. And in fact, a great deal of trade took place between them. The average death rate is believed to be about 5% at the most. And in most years, it was actually less than that. And the biggest killer were diseases and accidents, particularly diseases. And you see this image on the left where the wagons are all in a circle. The reason for that is that they needed to keep their oxen inside so that they wouldn't run away. It was not necessarily for defensive purposes. Next, I'd like to talk about slavery in the American South. Before exploring some of the information about the American South, I did want to just encourage people to try to look at some of the hyperlinks on Canvas, because one of the things that we have is this paradox in American history. We've got this southern origins of the United States. Many early presidents were Southerners and they were slaveholders, yet some people have called slavery America's original sin. Well, maybe some information, from some 1970s rock music. Southern Man by Neil Young really kind of accuses the South of a range of sins. And then Leonard Skinner came out as a response to Neil Young's song. So you might want to click on some of those hyperlinks. One of the things we see about slavery is that it spread throughout the U.S. territories. In 1790, most slaves were living along the southeastern seaboard of the United States, where the arrows are pointing here. Over the years, slavery expanded for a range of reasons. Probably the most important factor was a new piece of technology perfected by a guy named Eli Whitney. He perfected a cheap and easy cotton gin that separated the seeds of the cotton from the cotton itself. Eventually, cotton would be shipped to the British Isles. It would also be shipped to northern textile mills, and demand for slave labor increased just as the demand for cotton increased. Between 1800 and 1860, we see the huge increase in the value of the cotton that was exported from the United States. In 1800, only 7% of the U.S. exports included cotton. However, on the eve of the Civil War, clearly cotton was the #1 product that was exported out of the United States, making up more than 50% of the value of U.S. exports. By 1860, slavery had spread throughout the entire South. If you wanted to make money on a small cotton farm, you might want 1 or 2 slaves, but you didn't necessarily have to have one. However, large cotton plantations often included many, many slaves. Again, here's another visual that can help to explain some of the spread of slavery. In 1790, a little bit of cotton was produced, 4,000 bales. and we did have a lot of slaves, 700,000. However, over the years, as more cotton was produced, the number of slaves in the United States increased dramatically. On the eve of the Civil War, there were probably just shy of 4 million slaves in the United States. Now, one thing that I wanted to point out is that often people point to the American South and blame Southerners for slavery. Well, there was a great deal of Northern compliance when it came to slavery. So first of all, slavery existed in every single English colony, North as well as South. And during the colonial era, and for a little while during the early Republic, Rhode Island was a key slave port as they imported lots of slaves to that area. Those New England textile mills, well, as they were producing clothes and things like that, they used Southern cotton produced by slaves on huge plantations. And in a state like New York, a lot of people think, well, slavery didn't exist there because it was in the North. Well, slavery was legal there until 1827. However, by the 1850s, slavery clearly was a regional, slavery was only legal in the region of the American South. However, there still was Northern compliance when it came to slavery. Next, I'd like to explore some aspects of life for slaves. First of all, life for those who were enslaved actually changed over the years. In the early 1700s, the number of male slaves outnumbered women, as many had been born in Africa. However, as a result of a natural population increase, by the mid-1800s, the ratio between men and women became more even. The majority of slaves lived on large plantations with probably at least 10 other slaves. Generally speaking, they tended to work in gangs. Other than the areas in South Carolina that I talked about earlier in the semester, most worked in gangs where they were under the close supervision of whites. The autobiography of Solomon Northup, a slave narrative that's really powerful, offers tremendous insight into what life was like for slaves. Generally speaking, he described that they would have to wake up before sunrise, eat a quick meal, and then go out into the fields. Generally speaking, they would work from sunrise to sunset, with a short break, maybe around noon. He was expected to pick a quota of at least 200 pounds of cotton each day. In addition to that, chores had to be completed at night once someone had completed their daily tasks. Northup describes that typical meals were really the same almost every day. Cornmeal along with salted pork. In order to supplement their diet, they would often on their own raise some vegetables. Sometimes they would try to fish. They would even try to set traps and things like that to hunt small animals. Generally speaking, they were required to work 6 days a week. If they did work on Sundays, they could earn a little bit of extra money. And the era around Christmas, like the week or so between Christmas and New Year's, often was celebrated as an important holiday. That was the only time during the year where they didn't have to work. Slaves often were beaten or whipped, even for minor offenses. On the left, we see a torture mask that was used in some cases in order to punish slaves. If a slave wanted to travel from one plantation to another, he or she would be required to have a pass. Otherwise, they would not be allowed to travel. And if they were picked up by slave catchers, they would be punished. Slaves acted and reacted to their lives in many different ways. One coping strategy was to develop close family ties. On the right, we see a princess feather quilt, which was woven by Mississippi slaves. And sometimes these quilts would have messages that were known only to the slaves themselves. Often slaves would marry one another, and this was often encouraged by slave owners, mainly because any children from those marriages would also be enslaved. Although slaves placed an important value on family, sometimes those family members were separated and they were sold outside of the area where they were living because slave owners had so much control over their lives. Remember this slide from an earlier presentation? Slaves acted and reacted to their enslavement in many ways. Some were completely submissive and obedient, but on the other end of the scale, some were completely resistant. Most engaged in subtle resistance of some sort. Subtle resistance might involve stealing food, faking an illness, work slowdowns, things like that. Others ran away. It's estimated between 1850 and 1860, about 1,000 slaves used the Underground Railroad to travel from slave states to free states. Harriet Tubman became famous for leading so many slaves to freedom. Some slaves resisted by planning and engaging in rebellions. The image here shows a statue of Denmark Vesey. He was born a slave, but eventually obtained his freedom after he won a lottery. He was a skilled worker. He opened a carpentry shop in Charleston, South Carolina. He planned a rebellion along with some other free blacks, as well as some people who were enslaved. However, someone leaked the plans, and he was caught. Many other slaves were caught, and he eventually was executed. Another example of a slave rebellion was undertaken by Nat Turner, as shown in the image here on the left. This involved many slaves in Virginia. When they staged their rebellion, they were able to obtain their freedom for a short time, and about 60 whites were killed during this rebellion. However, he and then many other slaves were executed, and some who weren't even involved in the rebellion itself eventually were killed at random. So these slave rebellions were crushed brutally. One additional coping strategy was that many slaves looked to religion for guidance. The image here shows a slave who spread Christianity throughout many different plantations. Slaves often identified with the followers of Judaism in the Old Testament because they wanted their freedom, and they learned about the stories of Jews who had been enslaved by Egyptian pharaohs. Those Christian churches became important institutions on many of those plantations, and even in the years after the Civil War. Next, I'd like to explore some aspects of Southern society and begin with some ways in which Southerners justified owning slaves. The foundation for many of these justifications for slavery were based in racist attitudes, as many argued that it was, quote, natural for people of African ancestry to be enslaved. The Bible was even used to justify slavery, and one of these was included in a passage often referred to as the curse of Ham, where Noah cursed the children of Ham, and he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers," and basically saying that people of African ancestry must be the descendants of Canaan. This passage is found in Genesis chapter 9, beginning with verse 20. Additional passages also were used. When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, well, that owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. This is found in Exodus, beginning with chapter 21, beginning with verse 20. Essentially, you weren't supposed to kill your slave, but it's okay to beat your slave if they deserve it. Passages from the New Testament also were used. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, in singleness of heart, as you obey Christ. This is found in a letter from Paul to the Ephesians, beginning with chapter 6. So, passages from the New as well as Old Testament were used to justify slavery, as well as to requiring your slaves to obey their masters. Additional justifications were also included. Some were based on history. Well, the ancient Greeks and the Romans were the great civilizations of the ancient world. They owned slaves. Why shouldn't the United States? The United States Constitution protected slavery. In fact, it declared that a slave was equal to 3/5 of a person with the 3/5 compromise. Many of the nation's founders, like George Washington, the father of the country, Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, heck, they were slave owners. Therefore, these were used as justifications for owning slaves. Slave owners made additional justifications for slavery. Some described themselves as being paternalistic because they said, heck, slaves are kind of like children. They're members of our family. You wouldn't expect a child to live on his or her own. So slaves were in need of this help. They brought civilization and even Christianity to people that they considered to be heathens. Paternalistic slave owners justified their actions by saying that they took care of their slaves by providing food and shelter. A specific justification for slavery was advocated by the man shown here. His name was George Fitzhugh. He not only justified slavery, he said that slavery was a positive system because he compared and contrasted conditions for slaves to people who worked in northern factories. And he described northern factory workers as wage slaves. Heck, after someone received their weekly paycheck, no one looked after those factory workers' needs. And so he said that he claimed that the people working in northern factories operated under much worse conditions. He argued that slave owners even took care of their slaves as their slaves grew old, unlike many of those factory worker owners, or those factory owners. Those previous slides identified a range of justifications many made for owning slaves. However, their arguments did not explain the full extent of the conditions that people were living under. It ignored the separation of families, husbands and wives, parents and their children. And if slavery was so great, why did so many slaves try to escape? Also, they ignored the fact that individual slaves lived under horrible working conditions and they often faced violence. Next, we'll explore the makeup of Southern society. The image shown here might help to provide a visual aid identifying the makeup of Southern society. We see a pyramid. At the very pinnacle of this pyramid would be the great planters. They made up a very small percentage of Southern society, maybe 1%. They were kind of identified by, if you owned 20 slaves or more, you were considered to be a great planter. Next would be small farmers. This made up the largest portion of the population, somewhere between 35 to 45%. Some of these small farmers didn't own any slaves at all, but typically you might own as many as 5. Next came landless whites, maybe making up 20 to 25% of the population. These were whites who didn't own any property, but they might work on someone's plantation or they might work in another area, but they weren't property owners themselves. At the very bottom, at the foundation of Southern society, were slaves that made up probably about 35% of the population. One aspect that a lot of people are unfamiliar with is that by 1860, about 75% of Southern whites did not own slaves, which begs the question, why in the world would Southern whites fight to protect slavery in the Civil War if they didn't own slaves? Because many of those Southern whites who volunteered to fight in the Confederacy were the most ardent supporters of slavery, even though they didn't own slaves themselves. Many of them didn't. Well, I'd like to explore that idea of why someone who didn't own slaves would want to fight by exploring something that I call the small farmer model. So the small farmer model attempts to answer the question why Southern whites would protect slavery, put their lives on the line, even if they didn't own slaves. Well, first of all, large plantations were the center of everyone's social life. Remember this slide from an earlier presentation? Going back to the colonial era, differences emerged between people living in the Chesapeake as well as people living in the New England colonies. Large plantation homes had been the center of social life going back to the colonial era. Another factor was that very often those large planters, who sometimes were maybe arrogant or things like that, but anyway, they would often lend small farmers a helping hand. Just think of this. Let's pretend you didn't own any slaves and you wanted to hire one out every so often. Well, who would you go to for something like that if you needed some help on your plantation? You would go to the large farmer. If he's got 50 slaves, heck, he could loan you one and you could pay a small fee and get this helping hand. What about if you broke your leg and it was time to bring in your crops? You might need this large planter to help you, and often they were very willing to do so. Also, maybe that small farmer was somebody, or that large planter was kind of arrogant and things like that. But every small farmer's goal was to have the big, nice carriage like the big planter had. They had a goal, and they would always aspire to become a big planter themselves. And if you want to be a big planter, well, you've got to own a lot of slaves. If we can continue this concept, okay, all Southern whites, whether you were rich or whether you were poor, had one thing in common. They were white, and they weren't enslaved. If slavery existed, at least you weren't on the bottom of society, even if you were one of those landless whites. The bottom line is that people fought for the Confederacy in order to protect slavery. Maybe the best example of this would be the so-called Cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. When he was asked, well, why is it, or when he was talking about why did they form their own country, well, he said the immediate cause of the break and the present revolution was over slavery. And he declared, quote, "The Negro is not equal to the white man. Slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." Finally, the government of the Confederacy was, quote, "based upon this great physical and philosophical and moral truth." If you want to Google this, you can find the full text of Alexander Stephens' speech. Well, we're just about done. I'd like to review some of the key ideas included in the presentation. Well, this lecture addressed two primary areas. First, how and why did people travel to the American West? What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to identify these motivations and also how it impacted the nation. Next, you should be able to describe and evaluate life in the American South. Ultimately, why was it that someone who did not own slaves, why would someone fight in the Civil War in order to protect it? Hopefully, this lecture has addressed these topics. Well, that's all for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care. Have a great day, everybody.